Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This video is brought to you by First Detachment Nutrition. Battle tested, expert formulated. Use discount code AB10 at checkout for 10% off. Hey folks, Big Paul here today with another episode of Muscle Science with Kurth Havens. What's up, Kurt?
What's going on, guys? How you doing, Paul?
I'm good, man. We're gonna talk some Primobolan today. We've already done HGH. We did some trend. It's funny. Everybody came out of the woodwork on the HGH one. I knew that would happen. The HGH haters. I got quite a few of the people that were saying it's like the worst drug that ever happened to bodybuilding. And I don't know why people take HGH. There's so many. I don't want to go down too far down that rabbit hole, but so many myths around HGH that just aren't true. And what we'll have to do a whole other episode just to debunk some of that stuff too.
Yeah, my ebook should be ready to go shortly. We're just getting it formatted.
Yeah, I got a lot of people asking me about the ebook, man. I probably had a dozen people message me, where can I get the ebook?
So that should cover pretty much any questions. I mean, you read it. I mean, that should pretty much cover any question.
Yeah, it's very, very comprehensive. Yeah, so we'll let you know when that's up, folks. But let's talk some Primo, man. Let's go behind the history of Primo. When did Primo come about?
Primo came about in kind of what we would call the golden age of steroids, when all the pharmaceutical companies were rushing to come up with the next best thing to replace testosterone. So their official push was to find a safe alternative for women and children. A large part of it was actually to help beat the Russians in sports. We knew the Russians were using
the Cold War,
and we were just trying to figure out better drugs to help us win some games.
We had to have better track times.
Yeah, so Primobolan was kind of born out of that. It was first described in 1960 as a molecule, and it was first put into medical use in 1962 by Shearing, and that's where it got its name from. It was originally called Nibble and Nibble Depot, and it's changed hands a couple times. It went from Shearing to Squibb to Ciba-Geigy, and now currently under Bayer. So it's been in production since 1962, pretty much straight through.
Yeah, I know the real Primo, you can really only get it overseas now, Turkey and Japan and places like that. The Primobolan, the Bayer makes.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the name changed, but I guess that for patent reasons they redid it.
Probably.
So Primobolan is a DHT. It's a synthetic drug. It's not naturally found in any human or mammal. It's an androstened steroid, which means it was derived from testosterone versus like an E strain. A steroid that's derived from estrogen. So like nandrolone is an E strain. It starts at estrogen and then it's converted to nandrolone, whereas all the testosterone-based things, DHT things, are androsteneds. It's pretty similar to actual DHT. It has the same ketone group on carbon 3 that they all have. That carbon is what helps it bind with the androgen receptor. That's one of the key features of most anabolic steroids. And then it also has a carbon bond at carbon 1 and 2. A double bond of carbon 1 and 2. If someone actually corrected me on my post on Instagram the other day about it being broken down, similar to DHT, 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So I looked more into it. So it is broken down slightly, not as DHT is fully broken down and basically disabled. Right. So it looks like Primobolan is slightly broken down in the muscle. So it's part of the reason why it's not quite as effective as some stronger steroids, but it's I would say it's pretty irrelevant. So the interesting thing about Primobolan too is it has a methyl group at carbon 1 that allows it to be taken orally. So it's available in two forms, right? Primo enanthate, which is typically the injection, and Primobolan acetate, which is typically the oral. What separates the oral version, the acetate, is that it's not C7 alkylated, so it doesn't really jack up your liver quite like, Winstrol or any of those typical orals.
Oral Primo is really difficult to find. I don't know that I've ever seen it in the wild.
Okay, I've seen it usually comes in 25 milligrams.
Yeah, I've never used it. I have personally never used it.
It's probably not. It's not going to be as strong as the injectable. You'd be better off with using the injection. So they both. The interesting thing is the injectable Primobolan enanthate still has that methyl group at carbon 1. So you will see if you use inositol, that your liver enzymes might be slightly elevated because it'll still impact your liver a little bit, just not quite as much as like a carbon-17. So for people that haven't taken organic chemistry, the farther up on the carbon chain that you move the methyl group, the worse it is for your liver typically. So when you're on carbon-1, it's really benign, and carbon-17 is really not good. But you're going to preserve more of the drug by pushing it farther up to carbon-17. So that's why, like a D-ball, they have that methyl group there.
I want to back up for a second. Can you explain a little bit in more detail about dehydrogenase and how it destroys DHT and makes it not anabolic in the muscle?
So our muscles contain this enzyme. So testosterone is 5-alpha reduced to DHT in certain tissues, and then it's further when it binds to the receptor, it's basically then further broken down by an enzyme to turn into metabolites, and basically it no longer will cause any sort of muscle growth. That's really not what, in the human body, DHT is not really designed for hypertrophy. It's more to express secondary male characteristics.
Yeah, so, the way I look at it, it's a sex hormone, hair.
Yeah, so the body doesn't really want to deal with it in those terms.
Hair and hard-ons.
Yeah, so it'll still bind to the androgen receptor. It's just not going to express the same, gene set.
And and this is another thing too that I remind guys. Like I get these guys that think, I know, and I would assume most people know this, but I get a lot of guys that think something like finasteride or any 5-AR inhibitor is going to help with hair loss with this, but it's already reduced. It's not going to make any difference.
The only steroid that those drugs would work with would be testosterone, really.
Right.
If it's already 5-alpha reduced, there's nothing to stop. And in certain drugs like nandrolone, we could do a nandrolone video sometime. It'll actually make it worse. It'll actually make your hair loss worse if you take a 5-AR blocker with nandrolone. A lot of guys don't know that. They'll run that because they were using testosterone. They'll add nandrolone and the hair will fall out.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I remember Derek from More Plates, More Dates talking about that and how it blocks the conversion to DHN, which is actually safer, correct?
Yeah, technically nandrolone is more androgenic than testosterone. You kind of want it to convert to DHN.
Yeah, the DHN is...
If it goes too much, then obviously it causes sexual problems.
Right.
So milligram, kind of the cool thing about, so Primobolan, like we were talking about before we started recording, Primobolan is historically viewed as either a girl steroid or a very weak steroid. It's totally incorrect. And it's funny, in the last 5 or 6 years, I feel like you've really seen it come to the forefront.
Yeah.
A lot of guys use it. A lot of really big guys use Primo now. It tends to be very safe. I'd say probably it's the highest safety profile of any steroid. It is on a milligram per milligram basis, it's pretty much the same as testosterone and most of the other anabolic steroids as far as muscle growth is concerned. I think what guys were doing, most likely because of the poor oil solubility with it, it only comes in 100 milligrams per ml. And for the cost, guys were not running enough of it. So if you look at it in terms of a milligram basis, if you were to run 200 milligrams of testosterone, would you expect to grow a lot of muscle? Probably not.
No.
It'd be the same as if you ran 200 milligrams of Primo. So this is why the guys in the 70s were using 100 a day, right? Most of these guys, I think, were running 700 milligrams of Primo.
I have seen UGL Primo that's dosed to 200 milligrams. Man, it hurts like hell.
It wants to fall out of solution.
Yeah, it is. It is very, very, very painful injections with the 200 milligram Primo that I found. Primo has, in my experience, has some of the worst PIP out of any steroid I've ever used.
So that's probably from using the pharma grade stuff, right? You were using Bayer?
Both. I've tried both. I've used the Bayer and the UGL stuff. The UGL stuff's even worse, but it is
underground lab stuff.
Yeah.
So I would say on the Bayer side, on the pharmaceutical side, they've removed BB benzoate from it because infants have a tendency to be allergic to it, and it's used in small children pretty often. And it was removed, but that also is one of the things that kind of gets rid of that PIP. So on an underground lab side, I would be curious if because it's dosed at 100 milligrams per
200 are the ones I
with 200 per. Yeah, that's just going to be a concentration issue.
But man, the Bears kick like a mule. They're
when you remove the benzoate, it's going to do that.
Yeah, they're pretty rough.
Yeah. Okay. So it has a very low affinity for sex hormone binding globulin. I know a lot of guys are now very obsessed with SHBG.
SHBG.
To me, sex hormone binding globulin is kind of like a non-issue. I would generally just let your body deal with it the way it's going to deal with it. Only 16% of it binds to that with only 16% of testosterone and only like 3% of DHT itself. So it's not really being carried like that. It's mostly staying as a free hormone in the blood. Its closest chemical cousin is proviron, actually. And then after that would be pretty similar to Anavar. Chemical.
And proviron has no anabolic properties whatsoever, correct?
Because it's missing that it's missing that bond. So that bond is basically not allowing it to really work with that enzyme. And proviron doesn't have. Proviron is basically oral DHT. There's really nothing else to it.
Yeah, I know a lot of guys like to run proviron on contest prep for a hardener.
Yeah, and it probably kind of like, I almost look at it like it's a suicide thing. It almost like wastes itself so other things become more effective, right? You know, I'm not really sure what actual muscle hardening, short of it being a DHT, but I don't know what actually affects, proviron really has on muscle. I know it doesn't cause any muscle growth per se.
No.
So a lot of people also are confused with Masteron and Primo, right? So I think the simplest way to say it is Mast is basically like poor man's Primobolan.
Right.
Or the easiest way to say that. They're very similar. I would say a good way to look at steroids is how they were used clinically. And it kind of explains what they do. So Masteron was typically used in a place where you were looking for no tissue growth, versus Primobolan was used for a place where you were looking for anabolism. And it was usually used in anemia. So the production of red blood cells is still considered an anabolic effect. So they're kind of opposites in that way. I think the overall outcome of using one or the other is they're very similar. Masteron probably tends to be a little drier. There's some mineral loss and stuff with Masteron. Beside that, they're pretty interchangeable. I don't know what your experience between the two.
Yeah, I have found, this is all just bro sciencey anecdotal stuff, but I have found that Masteron gives me a drier look. Primo, I seem to grow better with Primo, but I do tell people that if you can't afford Primo, I'd rather you save your money, get Masteron, and buy some GH. Yeah, if you had the budget to allot in one area, I would save the Primo money, run Masteron, and get GH.
I would agree with that. Yeah, you're gonna get a lot more out of it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a better use of your funds. I've also one of the things I tell guys that I have noticed is that both Primobolan and Masteron actually, I think the real benefit of both of them is that it makes your testosterone work better.
Yeah, it definitely does. If you labs on them, you can see that.
You get less estrogen conversion. Yep. Estrogen conversion goes down. You get in free testosterone is higher.
Yeah, running. I would say Masteron has a stronger effect on estrogen than Primo, but Primo definitely has some. And it was used. I only know of one study where Primo was used for women's breast cancer, but I was using a huge amount of 1,200 milligrams a week. And
when I run Primo with my testosterone at about 80% of the dose, my estrogen cuts in half.
Okay, that seems about right.
Yep, that's what I have seen. Masteron does have a stronger effect. It was interesting. We had John Jewett on this past weekend, and John was talking about contest prep, how he doesn't run an AI. He said what he'll do is he just keeps cranking up his Masteron dose until he gets his estrogen at a point where he wants it for fat loss, or he'll plays with that ratio of Masteron to testosterone. He'll pull his testosterone down, increase the Masteron to get himself dried up and looking good for in a show, and pull his estrogen where he needs it to be crisp on stage.
It's probably a better method than running an AI if you don't need it.
Yeah, I thought that was a better methodology. His theory was, instead of throwing another drug at it, you can pour another anabolic on it.
Yeah, especially when the AI isn't really doing anything but blocking at that point.
Blocking aromatase. Yeah.
And what you were just saying about the dosing at 80%, I mean, my understanding is the standard dose between testosterone and Primobolan is generally 1-to-1 ratio. And
1-to-1.
Based on that, depending, right? I mean, that's what becomes a liquid volume problem or a money problem.
I mean, the reason I end up at 80% is just simple math, because the UGL Primo's dosed at 250 or 200, and the UGL test is dosed at 250. So it just works out that way. So if I'm running a gram of test, I'm running 800 milligrams of Primo if I'm doing 1 cc of each.
That
simple.
And I think that that's also one of the reasons why for years it didn't do well clinically as far as building muscle. Like in animals when it was tested, it didn't really do a whole lot. Or in humans, it was always used as monotherapy, right? So I mean, if you ran Primobolan alone, I'm really not sure how much tissue build without estrogen there.
Right.
And that's kind of why nowadays we kind of learn that you need testosterone as a base or something. Right? The only other kind of valid option, I guess, would be Dianabol, but not something that I would choose.
Right.
So unless you,
well, I mean, that's essentially what the guys did in everybody gets obsessed with the guys in the 70s, in the early 80s, not running testosterone, but they were running D-ball.
Yeah, and then they knew enough to pull the D-ball before a show, right?
Yeah, so that was they would run Primo in D-ball, and then exactly they would yank the D-ball out before the show.
And yeah, if you look at the cycles of any of those guys, no need to name names, but everyone that was on the Olympia stage from the mid 70s, probably
everybody knows. You talk to those old guys, Arnold and all those dudes.
Yeah, it's the same exact cycle for all of them.
Yep.
Zane, all of them, right? And then they would bring the Primo up a little bit and probably swap out the D-ball for Winstrol.
And then the off season, it was Deca and D-ball. That's what they ran.
Yep.
In contest prep, it was Primo D-ball, and then they'd yank the Primo at the end, or maybe throw in some Winstrol. That's what they did.
You're talking about like it being used with anemia. It actually it appears to be the second on the list for red blood cell count production.
I've heard that it's right behind equipoise.
The only thing greater. So and some studies show that oxymethylone is equal to Primobolan, and equipoise actually is below it. Now, in reality, I'm not sure if that's true. It also could be a dose thing, right? So guys that run a gram of EQ, most guys aren't running a gram of Primo.
I haven't seen that it elevates me the same way that EQ does.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know if in reality that proves to be true, but it does elevate red blood cell count significantly. And that's kind of where it was used, right? And that also could be one of its shortcomings, right? But beside that, I would say Primobolan's probably, assuming you have some sort of estrogen source, I would say Primobolan's probably the perfect anabolic that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, it is essentially side effect free from what I've seen. The only thing that I have noticed, it does seem on blood work, it does seem to suppress HDL a bit.
They're all going to do that.
But all DHT derivatives do that. I also think that reputation for being weak is bros associating side effects with strength. So you get a lot of stupid gym bros that think because D-ball and things like Tren make them feel like shit, that is them growing and having some sort of effect, or being bloated. A lot of guys confuse bloat with muscle growth.
Yeah, that's, they look at the scale, right?
Yeah, they look at the scale. They get obsessed with the scale. You get these guys that say, well, you don't really gain much, or you lose all your size when you come off cycle. It's just water. I don't have that experience with Primobolan.
No. And at least the theory is it seems to be the case with Anavar too, at least in studies. That muscle you seem to keep longer term too.
Yep.
Right, where they pull people off and they've tested them again, they've measured them, 6 months later, they still have that tissue that was built, versus, Dianabol, you don't retain any of that. I'm not even sure how much tissue is really built. Right?
No, Dianabol, in my experience, is just all bloat.
Yep.
Which is water and mineral retention. That's a thing too. We were talking about beforehand, is that it seems to be all pro bodybuilders come to similar conclusions. I have noticed that once guys hit that pro level, they stop using all the toxic compounds. And most of the guys I talk to the off season, they run test, Primo, HGH, and insulin. That's it.
Yeah.
Now they might run high doses.
Right? Yeah.
But that's sort of the
things are gone, right?
Yeah, that all the D-ball, Anadrol, Tren, all that stuff gets dropped in the off season. It's no longer around once guys turn pro. I think they start thinking about the sustainability of their careers, and then they just through trial and error figure out the other stuff just is not worth it.
Yeah. Now, and not that it wouldn't be more effective, but Primobolan is probably one of the more faked steroids.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to produce a noticeable result very quickly. When it's fake, the standard thing is it's generally 75% Masteron and 25% test propionate, because that kind of mimics the effects of what Primobolan would generate. That also, if someone is using underground lab Primo that's dosed at 100 per cc and they're getting some sort of pain from the injection, it's most likely that and not real Primobolan, because Primobolan dosed at 100, assuming it has benzoate in it, shouldn't cause,
I have seen most of the fake Primo I've seen from UGLs has turned out to be Masteron.
Yeah, it's cheap.
It's cheap, and most people are not going to know the difference between that. Yeah. I have heard of Equipoise, but although I
could be.
From what I've heard recently is that people have gotten so wise to it that the UGLs are not doing that anymore.
Yeah, although the at-home testing stuff just shows presence of a drug. It doesn't even, you could just add like a milligram of Primo and it'll still test, right?
Yeah, I don't know how those colorimetrics tests work, but a lot of people have those home tests now and are calling labs out on stuff.
Yeah.
So, or the lab may be getting fake powder and they don't know it.
You never know. I mean, it depends on where it's from, right? I mean, most of the raws are made in China at this point, and then,
So that's another issue. But I feel like, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel like the fake Primo thing has been vastly overstated. It's sort of like the fake GH thing. I'm sure there is some running around. I have sent stuff off from testing, and I've only once had fake Primo. It was Masteron.
Yeah, well, I would think also as it grows more popular too, there's going to be just less fake stuff out there, I would think.
Well, that and there are a lot of female competitors that use it, so they don't want to screw it up. Although I do know, I don't want to name names, but I do know a female competitor that thought she had Primo on her prep, and they got it. She couldn't lose weight. She was staying bloated up, and got a test done on the Primo, and it was actually Deca. I don't know why they would fake Primobolan with Deca.
Because they don't care about your health?
I guess. That's an odd thing, unless it was just a mislabeled thing. But
yeah, I mean, I know a female competitor who thought she was using Anavar, and it turned out to be Anadrol.
Oh, wow.
She grew a lot.
Hey, I'm sure she did. Grew an Adam's apple.
Yeah, there's some side effects there.
Yeah. Singing baritone in the choir afterwards. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's you do have to exercise some caution. That's why before I was just plunking down the money and getting the real bare stuff. But it's also really hard to source.
Yeah, if it's only in those two countries at this point. And I don't know if it's possible that the Japanese stuff is also being manufactured for other countries. I'm not aware. I've only seen the Japanese and the Turkish stuff now. It was in Spain at 1.2, but I think they pulled that.
And it's ridiculously expensive. Like it's like growth hormone level of pricing.
So, I mean, that's probably just the market too. But when it's manufactured, it is actually very fragile as a molecule. So it gets destroyed really easily. And that's part of the cost. Similar to Anavar, they're just very, very difficult to make from scratch. And the odds of you wrecking it, if you were to make it from scratch, most underground labs are not making the raw from scratch. They're buying the raw.
Mm-hmm.
And just adding oil to it. But if you were to actually synthesize it, it is incredibly fragile.
Okay, so the manufacturing.
There's some reason for the cost of it. I'm sure the labs that are making the raw are charging more per gram for than other.
So it's the manufacturing of the raw that's difficult, not the actual.
Yeah, it can get ruined really easily with heat.
Okay.
Actually, testosterone cypionate is like that too. If you actually let it boil, it's junk. Testy can be heated over its boiling point and it'll be fine. Testosterone, once it boils, the whole thing is garbage.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, that ester just doesn't like heat.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. But all right, so let's talk about dosing a little bit. I know we touched on it briefly earlier, and by no means is this a recommendation, but this is typically what I have seen other bodybuilders do. It's not what I'm saying you should do, but the majority of pros that I talk to that are running Primobolan, as you mentioned, Kurt, are running higher doses. They're running up around a gram or more of Primobolan alongside their testosterone. And I mentioned I'm running at 80%. That's purely just math of how pulling 1 cc of each comes out, but it's somewhere between that and 1-for-1 with your testosterone. I have seen some people that will absolutely bury their estrogen running Primobolan too high. I've seen other guys that doesn't happen to, but that's typically what I see is Primobolan being run with testosterone. Sometimes I'll see guys sprinkle in, the pros will sprinkle in a little bit of nandrolone with it as well, just a tiny little bit. like a third or even less, 25% of what they're running the dose at, and HGH and insulin. If that's a typical pro off-season cycle, it would be your test, Primobolan, maybe a sprinkle of nandrolone, maybe not, GH and insulin. That's what I see most pro bodybuilders doing in the off season. If it's not Primobolan, it's Equipoise or Masteron are the other two choices.
And I would say on the low end, because you get a lot of guys probably that follow you that are not running gram quantities of anything. I'd say on the low end, it's not to say 200 milligrams of it wouldn't have any benefit, but you're probably going to get very little out of that. And I would say probably under 350 or 400 is probably, it's almost not worth the time to use.
Right.
I feel like just like testosterone, once you're out of the really beginner stages, it's probably what, 500-600 at a minimum.
You know what I've wondered, and this is something I've speculated about, is for the TRT crowd, if it wouldn't make more sense, all these guys are on AIs, if it wouldn't make more sense just to run a low dose of Primobolan or Masteron instead. Well, it would probably be better.
Yeah, and I would say from an aesthetic point of view, I would think, again, I don't have anything to back it up, that if you were on, let's say you're on 200 milligrams of testosterone for TRT, if you were to use 100 milligrams of test and 100 milligrams of like Masteron, like Masti or Primobolan and F8, I would probably think you'd get a better look from that than you would from 200 milligrams of test. It'd be harder.
Yeah, I would think so too.
Most likely you would not need an AI.
Yeah, you shouldn't.
100 milligrams of test, if you need an AI, you probably need to have some genetic testing done to figure out what's going on there.
There are some people that are high converters. I'm a higher converter, but I've seen some insane. No, I've seen some insane stuff though, man. I had a guy one time that had a estradiol level over 2,000. I couldn't believe it, man.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
I know guys that can't run more than 150 tests without huge estrogen issues, and then an AI crushes them. So,
and I've seen the opposite. I've seen guys. I had another guy I worked with that he basically had no estrogen at all, almost none, just naturally.
And he didn't, and no side effects, or.
I mean, he seemed to be all right. He stayed super lean, but I've noticed what I have noticed, and I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here, is the guys that tend to stay super lean are lower estrogen converters, and the guys that tend to be fat, I guess you're, you know, the fatties, you know, what's the somatotype? Not ectomorph. It's endomorphs. Your endomorphs tend to be higher estrogen converters.
And it's like, which came first though? Did they get fat and then they produce more enzyme, or did they?
Maybe, but when I'm looking at cycles for somebody, I would consider this. And when you're building your own cycle, if you tend to be somebody who accumulates body fat more easily, I would lean into something like Primobolan or Masteron as your primary anabolic, as versus guys seem to be obsessed with DECA, D-ball, things like that for sizing. That would be a horrible choice if you're a guy that tends to be.
I would think so too.
Fat.
I would definitely weigh that in the decision making process.
And whereas if you're on the opposite end of this spectrum, if you're 8% body fat ectomorph who doesn't accumulate muscle, maybe something that would promote more estrogen conversion would be better for you.
You're just more, or just volume, right? Naturally thin. I
read something, and of course I'm off on a side tangent now, but I read the study about how nandrolone actually causes upregulation of aromatase expression.
Well, progesterone does. So yes, if you run anything and that's what's seen. Today I posted on Testosterone on Ment, and that's kind of what you see there too. Is it actually is not really producing that much estrogen, but the progesterone effects are huge, and so that monstrous effect there is pushing up the. See, then you just
interesting.
Power. Yeah, that's kind of the effect from nandrolone can definitely do that. If your test isn't in, it's probably an individual thing, but your testosterone has to be in a sweet spot with nandrolone in order for it to work right.
Right.
Otherwise, you just hold a ton of fluid and look horrible. But on its own, it doesn't do that, right? They ran DECA only cycles.
Yeah, everybody did back then. Mike Mentzer, all those guys.
So it was like, and none of them held a whole lot of water. So it was more when if there's estrogen present with those things, then it's going to magnify.
I used to run DECA only cycles when I was younger, and they really made me look great.
Yeah, how do you feel though?
Awful. I couldn't get an erection, and I had no sex drive. So
very short lived.
Yeah, they weren't fun. They weren't fun. All right, Kurt, I think it's a good spot to wrap up, buddy. I really appreciate you coming on today. And people, if you want to get a hold of Kurt, I'm going to put his contact information in the video description below. Hopefully we'll have the ebook up soon. And oh yeah, it's Atomic Life, right?
AtomicLifeCoaching.com.
AtomicLifeCoaching.com. Go there to check out Kurt, guys, if you want to book a consult or hit Kurt up for some science-based coaching. Thank you for watching.
Cool. Thanks.
For coaching or consultations, head over to www.anabolicbodybuilding.com to book your spot today. I can help you with optimizing hormones, fat loss, muscle gain, physique, athletic performance, nutrition, and health. For more information, shoot me an email at bigp3rd@gmail.com.